I really appreciated this year's Table Talk series. It's been on truth, diversity, and intellectual freedom and the tensions that can sometimes exist as we attempt to engage in each of these areas. Diversity, I think, is a particularly tough topic in academia and in universities, and I think for valid and fair reasons. I think there's a lot of confusion regarding definitions of diversity, so how we would define diversity and what we mean by that. I also think there's some confusion around what's the goal of diversity in higher education. I mean, is diversity the goal, or is diversity the goal towards, like, part of the goal towards something else? And I would be curious to hear a lot of different perspectives on this topic, these questions, and perhaps a future luncheon, Rick, could engage us in unpacking some of this diversity as a construct within the space of higher education, what that might mean for us at Biola. However, today I'm going to bypass that part of the issue because this semester's Table Talks aim to address more of the praxis related to truth and diversity on our campus, and I'd love to talk a little bit about some reflections I've been doing on cultural humility and what I've come to maybe sort of call informally diversity's miseducation, meaning some of the missteps I think we've taken in society in terms of our diversity and multicultural education. Just for a background on me, I graduated my undergraduate degree at UCLA, and then I did my PhD in clinical psychology here at Rosemead. So I've been on campus since about 1997. Right after I graduated Rosemead, I did a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship where I was teaching half-time here and working half-time at the counseling center. And then right after that, I was hired on as faculty here. So I've been here for quite some time. This is my 14th year of teaching at Biola. And as Rick mentioned, a lot of my teaching, at least for about the past decade or so, has been addressing some multicultural topics within psychology, especially at the graduate level. Within the discipline of psychology, especially in doctoral training programs of professional psychology, we talk a lot about cultural competence. And so for decades now, we've operated under a notion that because professionals are going to be interacting with culturally diverse people, patients, clients, that we should be sensitive to culture and knowledgeable about how it might impact our practice. Cultural competence involves awareness, knowledge, skills, and it was the model that dominated a lot of my training as a psychologist. But several years ago, as I was preparing a presentation, I discovered a construct called cultural humility. I found it in an article. It was an older article. It was published in the late 1990s, and it was the first time in all this time that I actually heard of cultural humility. And I found it in a healthcare journal. It actually, as I was reading further, it came out of the nursing profession. Go nurses. But I was immediately drawn to this. It was a shift in paradigm from having to be competent or an expert on cultural matters versus being open to learning, being humble. It was a significant shift that I believe lended itself so wonderfully to teaching and to integration. I think it's encouraging in recent years to see that cultural humility is being discussed more and more in psychology, but still not that much. Josh Hook over at the University of North Texas has really taken to publishing many articles on cultural humility. He just published a book on cultural humility as it relates to the practice of psychology and counseling. And I've seen a number of faith-based academicians sort of taking interest in this topic as well, perhaps for some of the same reasons I found myself drawn to it. In considering how the ways that I taught multiculturalism and diversity started to shift as I began to incorporate cultural humility into my conceptualizations of what makes a culturally competent practitioner, it made me think about whether cultural humility could help more than just the psychological and the healthcare community. Could this construct help us in higher education navigate some of these complex issues related to cultural diversity? So what is cultural humility? And if I could backtrack just a bit and briefly start out with just some thoughts on humility in general. Has there been psychological research on humility? Well, yes, right? We have Dr. Pete Hill. If this is Rosemead's website, you go to the front page of our website and it says the humility researcher, right? Pete Hill, you know, I mean, many of you have done research on humility. He's done a lot of research on humility. He could probably do a lot better job of talking about humility than I could. But if I could just present to you just a couple points about what some of the psychological research says that humility is and isn't before we move into cultural humility. This is just one slide. So aspects of humility that you would find in the psychological literature. It involves an accurate assessment of one's abilities and achievements. It involves keeping abilities and accomplishments in perspective. It has a relatively low self-focus. It involves an ability to acknowledge one's mistakes and limitations. So humility allows for imperfection and gaps in knowledge. It involves an openness to new ideas, contradictory information, and advice. Involves an appreciation of the value of all things. What is humility not? Psychological research has some stuff to say about that as well. They would say humility is not self-deprecation, self-debasement, low self-esteem, feelings of worthlessness. It's not modesty. It's not humiliation. It's not just the absence of pride or narcissism. Now, cultural humility, okay, if this is sort of the general psychological construct of humility, what is cultural humility? Well, I guess at one level, we could apply some of these aspects to culture. For example, an accurate assessment of one's abilities and achievements when it comes to cultural knowledge or awareness, or involves an ability to acknowledge one's mistakes and limitations as it pertains to cultural issues, an openness to new ideas, for example, openness to new cultures or new ways of doing or thinking about things. That could give us a ton to chew on, but let me add to this the construct that I came across in Tervalan and Marie Garcia's work, which promoted cultural humility as an alternative paradigm to cultural competence when it came to the training of healthcare practitioners. So this is maybe the definition of cultural humility that's thrown around right now. The ability to maintain an interpersonal stance that is other-oriented or open to the other in relation to aspects of cultural identity that are most important to that person. Individuals continually engage in self-reflection and self-critique as lifelong learners and reflective practitioners. Again, their article proposed cultural humility as an alternative to cultural competence. In proposing this alternative, they were critiquing the notion of cultural competence. For example, is it really possible for a person to be fully competent working with all cultures? What does that even mean, and how would we assess for that? If we kind of apply that to higher education, is it possible for us to be prepared to know how every student of every cultural background is going to be impacted by a class that we teach or by a policy that we create or something? What would be the role of a chief diversity officer? Are they an expert on all things diversity? Is that even possible? How would we know that? When we say we want to do diversity training for all of our faculty and staff, are we aiming for competence? And what does that even mean? Is that even possible? When I was in graduate school back in the 90s, my multicultural training was largely from this multicultural competence model. So I took a class that taught me things like, you know, when you're working with Asian Americans, you should, and when you're working with Hispanics and blacks, here's what you should know. It was very categorical. It ignored tremendous within-group variability. It ultimately perpetuated a ton of stereotypes about cultural groups. But I don't want to completely knock this model because multicultural competence was coming from a place where prior to its existence, there was practically no acknowledgement of culture. So when you're starting from ground zero, hey, at least now culture was being acknowledged. But folks began realizing over time that this model was limiting and in worst cases, harmful, as it maintained this idea that the practitioner was supposed to be the expert and should know all things about culture. But cultural humility, so do you see the shift in perspective? The practitioners are no longer supposed to be the experts of all things culture, but rather they're merely willing to learn from the other, willing to self-reflect and self-critique. This also shifted the power dynamic from expert-patient to one of mutual collaboration, right? Josephine Ensign, in her Medical Margins blog, writes, "Many people from the US bristle at the term humble, since it has religious zealot overtones and it shares the same root word as humiliate. But I like humble because it is from the Latin humus, ground or dirt. Culturally grounded, culturally dirty, culturally humble." Tervalan and Marie Garcia's definition of cultural humility emphasized a lifelong commitment to self-reflection, to pay attention to power inequities inherent in the healthcare encounter, and a commitment to develop partnerships with people and groups who advocate for others. And it was an orientation toward life. There was no end to cultural humility. Sounds good, right? My students, when discussing cultural competence, you can see their anxiety just rise. This feeling of not wanting ever to make a misstep, the feeling like you're walking on eggshells. Perhaps some of you have experienced that when we talk about diversity matters in higher education. But with cultural humility, there is an acknowledgement that we do not know and that mistakes would be inevitable. As I say in my undergrad cross-cultural psych class, it's not about learning how not to culturally offend. We will culturally offend, but it's about learning about how when we do offend, how to repair, how to reconcile, how to learn, how to grow. My graduate students say cultural competence is overwhelming. Will I ever reach it? But even my first year doctoral students can say, I can be culturally humble in my first year. I can nurture a posture of humility even as I learn how to increase in my cultural competence. Perhaps this is where I'll offer my first critique of how multicultural and diversity education has evolved over the years. I realize I'm painting with a really broad brush here, but in the 80s and 90s, diversity's buzzword was tolerance. So it was about learning how not to impose our views on another. It was about being able to coexist with people who are different from us. As the Oxford Dictionary would say, it's about the ability or willingness to tolerate something, in particular, the existence of opinions or behaviors that one does not necessarily agree with. But as I attended a lot of multicultural conferences in psychology, there was a very noticeable shift in the late 90s, early 2000s. Tolerance, simply speaking, was no longer enough. The buzzword was now advocacy. I remember hearing speakers say, it is not enough for you to simply acknowledge cultural difference, especially when it becomes clear that some cultural groups remain in marginalized, oppressed conditions compared to other groups. We must be advocates. And here we are nearly 20 years later, and advocacy and justice remains at the forefront of our diversity conversations. Advocacy and justice are good things. We should care about people who are marginalized, oppressed. We should care about injustice. When people are treated unjustly for whatever reason, but certainly for reasons that pertain to their cultural background or what some might call accidental traits of race and gender. I have some trouble with that language because my understanding of who God is does not lend me to believe that our race and gender is accidental at all. But you get the idea. This like, you were born in, you didn't have a choice over what race or gender you were, right? The Bible has plenty of references that show us God's heart for the oppressed, for the marginalized, but somewhere in this movement from tolerance to justice and advocacy, I can't help but feel that something went awry. I remember in the mid-2000s as the term microaggressions was picking up some traction. We don't have time to go into the details of microaggressions today, and maybe we don't have to because many of you guys invited me to speak in your departments about microaggressions in 2010, 11, 12, 13. The idea behind microaggressions was this recognition that people, especially people in historically marginalized groups, can often be subject to subtle, small, what might be perceived as trivial slights, insensitive or dismissive comments, rude remarks, and that the daily experience of such, the accumulation of these slights and insults can have real negative consequences for those who are on the receiving end of them. Now, I believe that there is much value in understanding what microaggressions are about, because if you understand the underlying implications of microaggressions, implications meaning that microaggressions usually are indirectly communicating messages about what is seen as normal, abnormal, superior, inferior, included, and excluded, that if you understand this, it can actually facilitate a lot of sensitivity. At its best, understanding microaggressions can be a powerful reconciliatory resource. But something began happening with this topic. As people began learning more about microaggressions, it was knowledge that was not utilized toward reconciliation. Rather, it was knowledge that identified and articulated wrongs that had been committed against me, and with the popularity and accessibility of social media, it was an opportunity to call out folks who committed these wrongs and demand better treatment, demand different language, demand change. In 2014, sociologists Bradley Campbell and Jason Manning wrote a paper on the transition of moral cultures in our society. In short, they described how our culture of dignity was now giving way to a culture of victimhood. And microaggressions, they said, were one example of this new culture of victimhood, often accompanied by a high degree of public shaming. And to be honest, as much as I think that understanding microaggressions is helpful, I also believe that their criticism was fair. What could have been used toward the building of understanding and the facilitation of reconciliation became rather fuel to demand certain types of treatment or license to publicly shame others. What was missing was humility. Without humility on the part of both the offender and the offended, the study of microaggressions had lost all of its ability to promote pro-social loving behaviors, but rather became another avenue of oppressing. And I'm using that word loosely here simply to refer to shutting other people down, right? The ways in which diversity education has evolved over the past few decades is troubling to me. I kind of feel like it's a house of cards because it's been built on a faulty assumption. For example, the notion of diversity training is at least in part based on the assumption that if people knew how not to offend, if they knew how to be more culturally sensitive, if they became aware of culturally different others, that it would improve the experiences of marginalized students on campus and ultimately benefit the campus as a whole. So we're talking about increased graduation rates, increased diversity of perspectives represented in all facets of higher education, decreased problems related to cultural mishaps, increased diversity of perspectives. These are good outcomes. Like, I want those outcomes on Biola's campus. And it would make sense to think that, yes, knowledge would propel us towards these outcomes, right? But perhaps this is the first step of diversity's miseducation. And these are just my reflections. So perhaps this is the first step. The belief that raising awareness and telling people what to say or not to say is enough to address issues related to diversity and inclusion on our campuses. The ways our larger society has engaged diversity education have amounted to not much more than attempts at behavior modification. Do this and don't do this. Say this, don't say this. Okay, it was okay to say that 3 years ago, but don't say it now, right? And as the landscape of higher education has largely moved away from addressing character growth and transformation as part of its educational mission, I believe we have missed something very important. That diversity education or multicultural education has much to do with understanding our depravity and growing in humility. Humility is that virtue that is not wanted by our broader American society. While some might value humility, it's often not something that someone aspires to because maybe it's seen as being weak, or maybe it's about thinking less of yourself, not more of yourself. Even as Christians, it's hard to want to be humble. Well, we want to be humble because Jesus was humble, but we don't like being humbled. At least I don't like being humbled. It's hard to be humble when our culture grooms us to be so focused on success, attainment, winning, competing. It's hard to be humble when society does not reward it. I propose that to do diversity education without addressing the depravity of our souls, without understanding the greater telos of loving God and loving neighbor, is a futile exercise, one that will only result in greater confusion, anxiety, that feeling of walking on eggshells, hostility among neighbors, among peers, among coworkers on our campus. I wonder even if perhaps diversity education should not even necessarily be diversity education. Perhaps education in humility or in cultural humility would be a better goal. I don't know. What would the goal of such training in cultural humility be, or the benefit? Well, if I'm just kind of brainstorming here, I would think, for one, it would give us and our students a greater ability to tolerate anxiety and the not knowing that comes with engaging cultural differences, that not knowing that kind of sometimes can create stress in us because we might be wrong about something. It would increase a healthy sense of interdependency and the need for community, the need for others, the need to see ourselves as one part of a bigger picture, this human collaboration, or this human project called life and society. At a faith level, a focus on nurturing humility would orient us and our students towards a right perspective of who we are, limited, finite beings who need things outside of ourselves, who need God and others in order to flourish and live the good life. What would education and cultural humility look like? And again, if I'm just brainstorming here, I think maybe it would have to involve some aspect of introspection, that self-reflection, that self-critique, with the goal of recognizing ways that we have been socialized, and sometimes socialized without our consent, to see the world. The ways we've been socialized to see other people, the ways that we have been socialized even to how to read and interpret the scriptures. But we couldn't merely stay in this self-focused space because humility is less of ourselves, right? So education and cultural humility would also encourage, I would think, an openness to diverse perspectives, viewpoints, diverse community. And in this context, we could begin to identify possible biases that we've acquired, adopted, whether explicitly or implicitly. And these are biases that impact the way we see our disciplines and the ways we see one another. In this context, we would have opportunities to learn from others, admitting that we don't know. It would involve a willingness to suspend judgment as we learn, even as we maintain personal convictions. We would be open to the expectation that in the course of such learning, we are likely to offend and be offended. But we would be committed to working through and reconciling when those offenses occur. Cultural humility would allow us a framework within which to understand ourselves and others, so that we could move forward in this pursuit of seeking truth while treating one another with dignity, while allowing multiple perspectives to be heard, even as we remain conflicted and divided on areas of cultural difference. Again, that ability to tolerate anxiety. And education and cultural humility would not have an ending, since it is, as Chervillon and Marie Garcia's definition points out, a lifelong posture. It's really more akin to character training. It would be transformation from the inside out, not behavior modification. It would be highly relational, not legislative. Jonathan Haidt has a lecture series in which he talks about two incompatible sacred values in American universities. He asks, what kind of university do you want? One that seeks to find truth through debate, or one that seeks to change the world through justice, or change the world, justice? He doesn't believe that a university can pursue both. His argument is that if we inject the telos of justice into the broader goal of seeking truth, it inhibits our ability to get at truth, because seeking truth requires viewpoint diversity. It requires the ability to tolerate anxiety and offense, and in his view, the current movement towards social justice is, rather than promoting truth-seeking discourse, it's resulting in the shutting down of truth-seeking discourse in the name of safety. I'm sure many of us are familiar with recent protests and demonstrations on college campuses because a controversial speaker was invited to present a talk or a lecture. I think Haidt has a point when he comments on the nature of social justice movements in our current society, but that kind of aside, I sort of want to gently push back a bit on this idea that a university cannot do both, meaning seek truth and seek to change the world. Indeed, Biola's mission statement seems to suggest that we are in the business of trying to do both, educating and growing our minds and impacting the world for Christ. This is perhaps why I believe places like Biola have a very ideal opportunity before us. That is to do what we do best, engage in complex, polarizing issues, integrating faith and a God-centered perspective of the world, and living out these understandings with the help of the Spirit. You know, it was a couple of weeks ago, maybe about 3 weeks ago, I was walking onto campus after I had parked my car in Lot B, and I was like, Biola's such a strange place to work. We talk a lot about integration of faith and learning, integration of psychology and theology. This idea of integration is quite fascinating, and I think I've been here for too long, because I just don't think about how fascinating that is, and I can kind of take that for granted. But I have these moments, like 3 weeks ago, where I was really struck by the strangeness of integration. What is the purpose of Christian higher education? And what is the purpose of my job here? What is it that I'm expected to do? Having come from a public undergraduate education where I barely got to know any of my professors, and if I did, not at any deep level, I was fed knowledge, I was taught to think critically, I was taught how to do psychology, which at the public state schools means how to do psychological research. But at places like Biola, there's this entire dimension of the spiritual life that we have access to, not only access, but in some sense we're responsible for. Dr. Randy Sorensen, a Rosemead professor who passed away many years ago, used to say that integration is caught, not taught. That is, the best ways that we teach our students how to integrate faith and learning is to model it in our own lives. And so here I have this permission now, responsibility, a strong sense of awareness that my pursuit of truth in academia is strongly embedded in my pursuit of God, and that the students are watching me and they're desiring to know how to do this well. Well, then how might I model cultural humility well? I appreciated what Tim Muehlhoff presented at the last table talk about teaching and modeling viewpoint diversity. To attempt with all sincerity and humility to understand where another person is coming from benefits both us and them. It broadens our understanding, it allows multiple voices to be heard so that we can have a broader, more nuanced understanding of a topic. And that's why we need diversity on our college campuses, particularly on Christian college campuses. Because if we want to seek truth, and if we want to cultivate the virtue of humility in our students, we can't actually do that if the people around us only believe the same things we do. No one becomes humble in a vacuum. Being around people who see the world differently, even if we share the same core convictions, allows the rightness of our views to be challenged. Some of you are like, I don't want the rightness of my view to be challenged because I'm right. Yeah, I think that sometimes. But allowing our views to be challenged allows us opportunities to broaden perspectives, to become more nuanced in our beliefs, to become aware of potential blind spots that might keep us from being able to effectively communicate or engage with others, that may keep us from being effectively able to impact the world for Christ. Ed Stetzer at Christianity Today recently did a great series back September, I think, on the Colin Kaepernick issue regarding kneeling during the national anthem as a form of protest. So he wrote an article in which he presented his perspective on why he personally believed that the kneeling was unhelpful. But then he invited others, colleagues at Christianity Today and folks outside, to also write articles on their perspectives on this topic. John Richards contributed an article from the perspective of the history of minority demonstrations. Pastor Charlie Dates wrote his perspective on why kneeling is not disrespectful. Michael Lee wrote an article on understanding worldviews and the meaning of the flag. Finally, Ed Stetzer wrote another article that kind of wrapped up the series, in which he talked about how disagreement, even among Christians, can be good. How disagreement is ultimately an opportunity to listen and understand. He writes, in light of these articles, I've been asked repeatedly if I have changed my mind on whether or not these protests are helpful. The answer is no, I have not, but more on that in a minute. My opinion has not changed, but it has become more informed, particularly with how other Christians are responding differently, and this is why we have open dialogue. I appreciate what Ed Stetzer did in this series. He provided a platform for others who do not share his views, to contribute their perspective so that in the end, the readers and contributors all would have a greater understanding of one another and of the topic at hand. It didn't result in everyone agreeing, but it resulted in information that led to greater respect and greater understanding. Now, I haven't yet referenced what the Bible says about humility. So many passages, not enough time to talk about here. For the past few years, I've been giving hour-and-a-half-long presentations at SCORE Conference on the subject of cultural humility. On your tables, there's a handout that I've used in my SCORE session, and there's 3 columns in this handout. In one of the columns, it has Bible passages that reference humility. In another, it has aspects of humility from psychological research. And another has aspects of cultural humility. I think it's always encouraging when you can find overlap from both general and special revelation on topics like this. But while there's a sense of overlap on humility, I think the Bible takes our understanding of humility in just like a drastically different direction than what culture and what maybe general revelation can point out to us. If I could point out one passage in Philippians chapter 2, well actually I'm going to point out a couple, but this chapter talks about Christ's example of humility. So verse 3 says, "Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others." Okay, so looking to others' interests, like being open, that sounds like stuff you might find in cultural humility, right? But if we keep going, "Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross." Okay, well, gosh, that takes it really further, right? See, Jesus was humble, but he wasn't humble in the ways that's talked about in psychological literature, in the sense of, because he wasn't limited in his knowledge. He wasn't finite in his understanding. His humility was one where he had all this knowledge and he gave up all these rights that he was entitled to for the sake of obedience to God the Father, for the sake of love, right? A biblical understanding of humility takes us in a sharp direction away from where diversity and social justice discourse is taking us in broader society. Current societal discourse, when it comes to matters of diversity, is at least partly about fighting for rights, demanding others treat us better, demanding safety, demanding we be affirmed in everything we do and every part of who we are. But biblical humility says we must seek to understand others first. It requires a letting go of entitlement. The trajectory of growing in humility is not one of self-actualization, but one of self-denial for the sake of the other, whether that be for the sake of loving God or the sake of loving our neighbor, or both. And as I mentioned before, it is highly relational. Now, here's where I might anticipate some criticism. Well, some of you probably have criticism about this entire talk. That's okay. I actually, these are just reflections. I would love to engage and hear your perspectives, because I think my perspective is simply that. It's my own. And I think it could be and needs to be broadened with input from all of y'all. But a critique I can anticipate, because I held it myself, was this tension I felt between how to balance humility with the work of justice. How can we be humble while, quote unquote, doing justice? Does social justice work advocacy, is it compatible with humility? As I was preparing several years ago, my first SCORE conference on this topic, this question troubled me. Because when I think of social justice and advocacy, while I do think of compassion and acts of service, I also think about protests and civil disobedience and calling out wrongs and fighting against systems that perpetuate inequality and oppression. So how can you be humble while doing justice? Because let's be clear, God has called us to do justice, right? Micah 6:8. How do humility and justice work together? And as I was praying over this topic for weeks, I kept coming back around to this verse, Colossians 3, where it says, "Put on then as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, patience, bearing with one another. If one has a complaint against another, forgiving each other. Above all these, put on love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony." Something inseparable from humility is the need for love. And I was reminded of the love passage, right? If I speak in the tongue of men and angels but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains but have not love, I am nothing. If I give away all I have, if I deliver my body to be burned but I have not love, I gain nothing. The Corinthians culturally valued knowledge, especially around abilities to understand spiritual mysteries. Knowledge is important, but as Paul states later in chapter 8, or earlier in chapter 8, he says, knowledge puffs up, but love builds up, right? It's important to seek truth, to seek knowledge. It's important to do justice, but without love, it's all nothing. So what about this love? Love is patient and kind. It does not envy or boast. It's not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It doesn't rejoice at wrongdoing. It rejoices with the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. 2 years ago, maybe it was more like three or 4 years ago at SCORE conference, I received a question from a student of color at the conference at the end of my talk, and she raised her hand. She says, but what about when that other person continues to persist in discrimination, in invalidation, in oppression? I try to bring up, I try to educate, I try to tell them, share my hurt, and they continue to persist. When I heard that question, it was interesting because SCORE is what, Friday, Saturday. This session happened on a Saturday. About Wednesday that week, I'd gotten into a huge fight with my husband. It was, I don't remember what it was about, but I remember it was about something that we fight a lot about. So it was like a repeated theme in our marriage, right? And I remember I was fuming. I was so angry, and I kept thinking to myself, at what point do I stop allowing these repeated hurtful offenses against me? I mean, how many times do we have to have this argument, right? And when we argue, my husband and I, we're passionate people, we yell. Okay, so we're, right? And when it gets bad, when it's a bad argument, he usually leaves the house to cool off for a while. Okay, and I think that helps, like we just need a little break from each other. So it was one of those nights. He left, it was probably about 11:30 at night. So he left, my kids are asleep, not that I would have talked to them anyways, but I was like, and I just wanted to process with somebody. Like I wanted to kind of like talk to someone. It's not like I was gonna call anyone. I wanted to process with him, but he was too mad, right? And so I was just like, I was just so mad, and I actually sat down at the computer, and on Google search, I typed in, how many times do I forgive it, right? Okay, I did that. And the first thing that popped up on Google search was this verse, Matthew 18. Peter came up to him and said, Lord, how often will my brother sin against me and I forgive him? As many as 7 times? Jesus said to him, I do not say to you 7 times. I hated reading this. I was like, what? God spoke to me through Google search. I thought, this is how God forgives me, though. So humbling. Loving the ways that God loves is hard, and it's impossible to do in our own strength. Only with the help of God's Spirit can we even begin to recognize the depths of what God's love means in informing how we're supposed to navigate the cultural tensions that exist in our society. But I believe God helps us, amen? Love is the biggest marker that identifies those who follow Jesus and strive to live by his commands and those who do not. Actually, I think the only reason I can love, or at least try to love the way God loves, the only reason I can seek to obey God and forgive in the face of oppression, or love and pray for my enemies, or bless those even who are persecuting me, I think the only reason I can do that is because I know and believe who God is, and I know how he has loved me, and that he is a righteous God. He is a just God, that he cares, and he's gonna make it right. I come to believe that even social justice can become an idol. For the Christian, the end goal must not merely be justice. Real justice can only come through God establishing his kingdom. The end goal has to be God. Knowing, loving, glorifying God. I think that's the difference between what it might look like for Christians to pursue matters related to social justice versus non-Christians. And when the end goal is God, seeking to love him more, seeking to understand his heart towards people, seeking to be transformed into Christ-likeness, the work towards social justice, I think, will take us into deeper and deeper places of brokenness. It'll take us deeper into our own depravity, to our own need for Jesus, and to humility. It will lead us to confession, and ultimately, I would hope, greater love. I really appreciate this quote by the late activist Ammon Hennessy, where it says, "Love without courage and wisdom is sentimentality, as with the ordinary church member. Courage without love and wisdom is foolhardiness, as with the ordinary soldier. Wisdom without love and courage is cowardice, as with the ordinary intellectual. But the one who has love, courage, and wisdom moves the world." And I would say a good test of humility then for us to reflect on is, am I becoming more loving? The real world might see humility as weakness, but humility is not weakness. Rather, there is much power in humility because God is on the side of humility. At Biola, I think we have a very unique and ideal opportunity before us, and I think time is of the essence. If our institution does not do the job of teaching our students to think critically and integratively with regards to diversity, if we cannot model humility in the ways we engage our disciplines, in the ways we engage one another, in the ways we do justice, in the ways we engage our students, then our students will have only the cues that are being offered from the broader society. But I'm really hopeful because I work on a campus with colleagues who love Jesus. We might hold different views and understandings on a lot of different topics, but I think I work on a campus where we would all agree that we are broken and in need of things outside of us. We work on a campus where people for many years have been doing a lot of thoughtful work related to diversity and trying to bring understanding and broadening that to this entire community. I pray that, and I've been praying, that this brokenness and need for one another will be what allows us to be more open with each other in a spirit of humility for the greater goal of, loving God, but as an institution for the greater goal of seeking truth and impacting the world for Jesus. Thank you.
Biola University prepares Christians to think biblically about everything, from science to business to education and the arts. Learn more at biola.edu.